pleasure to be able to introduce Hasia Diner, who is here a little preemptively now, but was supposed to be coming after the lecture that got canceled for last night. And Laura will give us, do you want to do it at the beginning or at the end?
Yeah, so this hasn't been posted on the website yet, but will be soon. Next week on the 28th, Laura will give lecture 2 in place of lecture 3, and Hasia will be here to give the response. Lecture 3 will then be scheduled for April 12th, which is a Thursday, and it's to be determined if the respondent will be able to join us. But the respondent, Barbara Mann's Brown Bag Lunch, will stay, and the date was originally scheduled. And if you have questions, you can approach me afterwards.
So back to introducing Hasia. Incredible honor to have Hasia here today. That Hasia's work, I mean, I'll go through and tell you some of the highlights for people who haven't read all of her numerous books and many of the awards that she's gotten over time, but really Hasia's work has been incredibly important on several different fronts for Jewish American history and for American history, particularly for Jewish American history because she has feet in both camps in terms of ethnic American histories and Jewish American history. She's been really crucial for helping us rethink the way we talk about Jews in relationship to broader American history, and that's really her work. Her larger history books on Jews in the United States have changed the way we think about periodization in terms of what are the defining moments for American Jewish history. And a lot of her work in terms of Italian American history and Irish American history has been really important for that conversation and not just thinking about Jews in some sort of isolated bubble. The other reason why I'm super thrilled to have Hasia here today is that she really is the person who came along and said, what would a narrative of Jewish American women look like for a historiography, as opposed to we had collections before of like essays here and there and isolated women, but it's really her book, Her Works Praise Her, that thought about thinking about Jewish American women's history as being an alternate historiography and how that would not just be like add women in stir, but would actually change the shape of how history is being made. So just an incredibly important history, and I'm really thrilled to have her here. Hasia, do you want me to give some of your other titles? Are you happy with that? Okay.
I'm totally fine with that.
Thank you so much, and I will turn it over to Hasia.
Okay, great. So it's really an honor to be here, and I just want to thank Laura and Laura. Okay, double Laura. In fact, in my little handwritten notes, I have Laura with S, Laura's. And thank you all for being here. And I don't know if this talk would have made more sense if you had heard me last night in response to the wonderful paper on the ivory miniatures, which I learned so much more. I learned so much from, but I guess I'll save that for next week. So this is a broad brush talk that, and I know I have a half hour and then a half hour for questions, and if you could keep me honest.
Yeah,
I
sure.
don't have a wristwatch, so I have my iPhone, and I'm hoping nobody calls. I don't think they should. I turned off the ringer. It's a kind of broad brush talk about the nature of American Jewish history and the kind of contours of what that means, what that looks like, and how to explain it. I think the title that I had sent in was How America Met the Jews. Now, that could have a question mark at the end, right? It could be a question, how did America meet the Jews? Okay, or a declarative statement, how America met the Jews. Either way, I want to explore in the 26 minutes I have left those aspects of American history and culture which created for the Jews an environment which made it an attractive migration destination and an environment which over time produced, and I'm not being hyperbolic, but the largest, freest, most culturally experimental, least fettered, creative wealthiest Jewish community that ever existed in the centuries-old history of the Jews. In other words, one could say there was never anything like it. Now, I am not a numbers person, but I am going to offer one two-part statistic that is the context for this. So, in the great age of migration, okay, which is approximately from the 1820s through the 1920s, so this is the great century of Jewish and European, in general, migration to the United States. Not that there weren't immigrants before, obviously there had to be, and not that people didn't come after the 1920s, but then this is the age of, for white people, unrestricted, limitless migration. Okay. In that period of time, approximately 1/3 of European Jewry picked up and crossed a national border to make a home in some new geopolitical setting. Okay, that is, Polish Jews left and went to France, or Lithuanian Jews left and went to South Africa. So there's a worldwide migration. Okay, now, of the 2/3 that didn't, they were also mobile, but they tended to move within the boundaries of their own nation state or their own empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire in particular. But of that 1/3 who moved, okay, who crossed a national, of that 1/3 who crossed a national border, 85 to 90% came to the United States. Okay, we might say everybody did that. That is, the 10 to 15% was a kind of negligible statistic, and we have good reason to assume, and in some cases we actually can say we know, that of that 10 to 15%, many wanted to come to the United States but couldn't. Okay, they couldn't for a variety of usually personal or familial reasons. An uncle was already living in Buenos Aires, okay, or as the United States government began to put some conditions on white European migration in terms of certain health criteria, they were unable to do so and didn't. We actually have a recently published wonderful book on Jewish illegal migration after the 1920s. And what we learned from this book is that, in fact, substantial numbers of Jews who went to places like Cuba and Mexico then infiltrated into the United States as undocumented. Okay, and this became somewhat of a political concern for Jewish communal officials, because they didn't want to be lumped with other, they didn't want Jews lumped with other illegals. So 85 to 90% came to the United States, which I think allows us to say that it was a pretty attractive destination. Okay, it was the magnet. Okay, we can hear almost that whoosh that, you know, of the magnet drawing in those who sought to enter. So what I want to do in this talk is ask, what made it so attractive? Okay, why was it more attractive than so many of the other places in the world, which also had unrestricted migration? Okay, the British Isles are a very good place to think about. England did pass the Aliens Act to restrict immigration a bit earlier than the United States did, but still throughout much of this period it was open. It was obviously a place of tremendous freedom. It was a very congenial environment. Why was the United States more attractive than the British Isles or Australia or South Africa? What made it so attractive that 85 to 90%, not 50%, but 85 to 90% chose to go there? So what I want to do is sketch out 5 aspects of American life that provided that magnetic draw. And say that that this was something the Jews did not shape. In other words, it was there. It was part of the American scene. It was part of the set of American realities that potential immigrants recognized and over time were drawn because of these characteristics. And that ultimately migration, as one commentator said, migration begets migration. That is, as large numbers of people from a particular family, a particular town, a particular region made their way to a specific place, it drew in others from that same family, that same town, that same region, and so on. But what were these 5 overarching characteristics of American life, some of which we can see even present in the 17th and 18th century, Laura's area, chronological area. Some of them, again, present in somewhat protean form in the 17th and 18th century, in the 18th century, but becoming increasingly prominent and manifest in this long 19th century from the 1820s to from the 1820s to the 1920s, that made migration to America the place of choice. Okay, the top of the list. So I'm gonna list them, and then I'm gonna turn to each one and very rapidly denote what was going on, and then we can use the discussion to flesh these out. So the first issue is just immigration itself. Okay, so Jews were in this, like all other Europeans, in that the United States, or even, well, the United States was the world's largest receiver of immigrants. Okay, it was the place where, to which the largest percentage of immigrants went, the widest array of groups over this entire century, as well as both before and after. Not that immigrants didn't go to other places. Okay, in places like Canada and Argentina, and in fact, a larger percentage of their population was made up of immigrants from this century of migration, but no other society was as much the focus of European immigration. So Jews, in essence, joined in steerage, to use perhaps a material culture metaphor, people from all over Europe who were on their way to America. The implications of this, I think, for our topic here is not only that the United States was a place to which so many immigrants went, and Jews were just part of this flow, but in the course of American history, there was nothing terribly unusual about Jews as immigrants or as the children of immigrants. So a city like Chicago in 1900 was 80% of the population were immigrants and their children. Okay, so from Italy, Hungary, Greece, Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, and so on. And so for a Jewish immigrant and her parent, or a Jewish immigrant and her children, her sons, her daughters, there was nothing unusual in the public sphere to be part of this immigrant mass, or this mass of immigrants and their immediate offspring. So no one group dominated the population, particularly in the large cities, and they were a jumble of peoples from around the world. So there's a lovely book written in the 1920s by a Romanian, claimed he was a count, probably wasn't, called Around the World in New York. And he said, you know, you don't have to travel abroad if you want to see the world. All you do is just traverse the streets of New York, and everybody's there. I think in addition to this, in this long century, again, of which coincided with the Jewish and the European migration, Jews were never not only were they never the only group or the only people to embody the idea of foreignness or alienness or outsiderness, but they were in fact not the focus of anti-immigrant fantasies, anti-immigrant hatreds. Okay, not that they were universally loved, they weren't, but rather in the early part of from the 1820s till about the 1870s, 1880s, the bad immigrants were the Irish. Okay, and one might say that public policies, public discourse about what was wrong with immigrants, and I think is something we can relate to because we live in a world now where there's a lot of public discourse against immigrants. It was about the Irish. Okay, and Jews were, yeah, they were there, but they were not the objects of this vast discourse. Starting in the 1880s, 1890s, it was the Italians. Okay, the Italians were the group who would never become American, who would never learn English, who would never move up from the lowest level of the labor force. They were the ones who were primitive and posed a great threat to American life. Okay, again, the Jews were, they had their detractors, they had those who had problems with them, but they were not the focus of that anti-immigrant fantasy, and they were, in essence, they stood under an umbrella with all these other immigrant populations, with, one might say, if we're going to make it metaphoric, with the Irish and the Italians standing in the front, receiving the barbs. Okay, and Jews were kind of lurking in the back. Okay, secondly, of these 5 characteristics of American life that made the Jewish encounter with it easy and positive, and which, again, I'm obviously flattening this out because I have only a half hour, but in the main, I would stand by that, is the fact they were always defined as white. Okay, Jews were always white. Now, it doesn't mean that they didn't suffer here and there discrimination of one kind or another. And it doesn't mean that in the early period, by the way, before the 1820s, which is when this larger narrative really takes shape, they did suffer some levels of state-based discrimination, in particularly a matter of office holding. But that had nothing to do with were they defined as white or not, but it had to do with religion. Okay, and so if a state said in order to serve on a jury, you had to put your hand on a King James Bible, it wasn't about white or not white, it was about Protestant or not. And if a Jew couldn't put his hand, since only men got to do this anyhow, his hand on a King James Bible, then the issue was not one of race, but of religion. But at no point in American history were Jews denied the benefits of the civic arena. You might be familiar, I don't know how many of you studied American history on the undergraduate level, but one of the first acts of the U.S. Congress in 1790 was the Naturalization Act, in which Congress, the very first Congress, the one that put all this into place, pondered the issue of who could become an American. Okay, and the law was very clear. Any white European man could become naturalized. Okay, very clear. Okay, and Jews were never outside of that definition of being white European. Okay, and therefore, for whatever discrimination existed, whatever ugly words might have been hurled in the press or on the stage or out of the mouth of some politician or another, Jews always had the right to enter contracts, to go into court, to sue or be sued, to flex their muscle politically, to have whatever advantages the state gave to any other white person. Now, in a society in which color was the difference between having control over your life, your body, your physical mobility, it mattered a great deal. Okay, and we know that Jews in Europe knew a good deal about the nature of American race relations. Okay, thirdly, and again, moving quickly, the third factor in this gravitational pull towards the United States, and maybe it should have been the first, is that in this period of time where the Great Jewish Migration took place, the United States was the most dynamic economy in the world. Okay, there was no place else which was moving at such a rapid pace in terms of economic development, and it was a place in which, for somebody who was white and had some willingness to go wherever the jobs were, it was a pretty good bargain. Okay, and we could say that at every point in the interaction between Jews and the American economy, they had a set of economic experiences, occupational experiences from their pre-migration lives that were a kind of perfect fit between what they knew and what America wanted. So I'm just going to give two very, very quick examples to move this along. So in the from the middle of the 19th century onward, and well into the early 20th, but mostly in the 19th century, as Americans, white Americans, spread out across the continent, moving to all sorts of places, Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, Oregon, wherever, upstate New York, they were in need of somebody, some individuals who were willing to bring them the kinds of stuff that they wanted. Eyeglasses, picture frames, needles, thread, cloth, shoes, stoves, you name it. And so uncountable numbers of young Jewish men came to America from all over the European continent and began their lives as pack peddlers. Okay, they went out on the road carrying stuff on their backs, and again, because they were white, they could do that. Nobody asked to see their pass. Okay, and they went wherever there were going to be paying customers who wanted that stuff. Okay, most of these peddlers became shopkeepers, and that is, they graduated from walking the roads to having a store. Some of them became fabulously wealthy, and I'm sure names like Guggenheim resonate a bit, or Lehman. Okay, and these were all people who started out as pack peddlers. Now, most did not end up as Guggenheims or Lehmans or Seligmans or Rosenwalds. The majority own modestly successful shops in small towns and big cities, but got their start in pack peddling. And this had been the Jewish métier for centuries. The Jews had been doing this in Europe and in the Ottoman Empire for centuries. So it was, in some ways, as the kids say now, a no-brainer to pick up the same occupation. Likewise, starting in the 1860s and 1870s with the expansion of the American garment industry, okay, an industry in which most of the employers and entrepreneurs happened to have been Jews, and some of them, in fact, former peddlers, who now, with the revolution in technology and the development of the sewing machine, begin to transform the way Americans dressed, particularly American women. And the garment industry takes off. By the 1920s, it is the largest employer, for example, in New York City. Okay, and now Jews had a long encounter with sewing as a craft or as an occupation. I'm not sure, again, since you all work in material culture, you might be able to help me out on the difference between craft and occupation. I don't know how skilled it was, but that's in some ways less important, that it was a familiar way of making a living. And there was a kind of perfect marriage between this mass, particularly of East European Jews from the Austro-Hungarian and the Tsarist Empire, who were familiar with needle trades, coming to America and making their first, or indeed their whole lives, in the garment industry. So in the 1905 state census of New York, 65% of New York Jews, most of whom were immigrants, worked in the garment industry. Okay, so the fact that this encounter took place was very much an attraction for further and further immigrants. And it interestingly was the one place in the American economy where an immigrant laborer, relatively unskilled, new arrival, was going to work for somebody from their own group. Okay, that is, they weren't being employed by Andrew Carnegie or John D. Rockefeller or some stranger, but by somebody with whom they shared a certain set of cultural affinities. Next week, I think the 29th, we're going to be marking once again the anniversary of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. Okay, it is notable that the owners of Triangle were former Jew immigrants from Eastern Europe. They weren't anti-Semitic non-Jews who didn't care about their employees, and so these were people who themselves had been immigrants from Eastern Europe, who had been sweatshop laborers, who were able to save enough to open the factory. So the encounter between America and these masses of Jewish immigrants, about 3 million in this century from, I guess that's now my third statistic I gave, in this century from the 1820s to the 1920s, were very much drawn by the nature of the American economy and what it offered those who did not suffer any disabilities from entrepreneurship or mobility. Okay, fourthly is the area of religion. Okay, and there's a certain irony here that I'd say Jews were assisted in their integration into America because of their religion, in a way, because when we think about the history of European interactions with Jews, Christian European interaction with Jews, it was the Jews' religion that had been the source of their being made into the demons and the others of deeply Christian societies. In America, Jews were valorized by their religion. First, they weren't Catholic. And in a society that was profoundly anti-Catholic, Jews were able, in fact, there were a number of Jews who were involved in the Know Nothing movement, okay, which was this political movement against Catholicism. And Jews, and within the religious sphere, for the most part, associated themselves with American Protestantism and could appear as sort of the good other religion as opposed to the bad other religion, namely Catholicism. Those of us who are in the room who are old enough to remember the 1960 election when John Kennedy was running, even by 1960, there was still, he had to go to the Houston Ministerial Conference, these were Protestant ministers, and stand up and say, I promise you if I'm president, I will not be the president of the Catholics, I'll be the president for Americans, and my Catholicism will not dictate what stance I take on public policy. That is, anti-Catholicism as late as the 1960s was still a theme running through American political life. Jews, by contrast, Judaism, by contrast, was viewed as, in fact, slightly noble religion. And there are wonderful sort of examples from the American press in the 1850s, 1860s, where non-Jews would visit a synagogue and they'd say, this is exactly what Solomon's temple looked like in Jerusalem. And they would talk about what an now, they didn't understand what was going on, but some very impressive religious ritual. In fact, the first book published by an American-born rabbi, although he was trained in Europe, was called The Stranger in the Synagogue, and it was a guidebook, and this is in the 1860s. It was a guidebook for visitors, voyeurs, who wanted to visit a synagogue service, and to explain to them, well, what's that, and what are they doing next, and what's going on. So it says that this is becoming part of the fabric of community, of American community life. When synagogues were dedicated, Protestant ministers, the governor, the mayor, the local judiciary would come to this important civic event, the opening of the first synagogue in Akron, Ohio, or Washington, D.C., or Kansas City, or the like. So in a society in America, which we know to this day considers religion really important, Americans are still considered to be the most religious people in the world, and they have the highest rates of believing in God of any, I think, in every international study. Americans think religion is a positive force for morality. Jews and Judaism and the institutions of Jewish life worked very much to portray themselves as one of those important, legitimate religious traditions or communities that took its place in the American civic arena. So just as one example, when World War I broke out, or when America entered World War I, the War Department decided that there had to be a chaplaincy service, partly because they were worried about what young men, if there are going to be millions of young men in the military, what are they going to do with their free time? And I think the assumption was they're going to do some pretty bad things with their free time. And so they decided to create a chaplaincy service. Now, not surprisingly, the Protestants are represented in this chaplaincy. I mean, they made up about just under 50% of the American population was Protestant. And the YMCA was given authority over the Protestant chaplains. The Catholics get represented. The Knights of Columbus were in charge of organizing the Catholic chaplains, and Catholics were just about 47% of the country. You would think that would be enough for the Army, but Judaism gets represented in the chaplaincy service as well, and the creation of the Jewish Welfare Board was designed to provide Jewish men with chaplains in the military. Now, Jews represented about 2 to 3% of the population. Okay, we could push it and say maybe 4%. Okay, so here are these two giants, Catholicism and Protestantism, and yet the Jews get included as an important religious element to serve the American military, and I guess to prevent those young men from doing nefarious deeds during their free time. Okay, and finally, I want to turn to the realm of politics, and hopefully I have stayed within my just about. So when we get to American politics, I think there are a couple issues to deal with, besides the fact that Jews were never, other than in that period before the 1820s, and just say that until the 1820s, there were a few states, North Carolina, Connecticut, Massachusetts, which until then had some religious qualification for office holding. Again, it was affirming belief in Jesus Christ as your Savior, which obviously a Jew could not do, or if a Jew did it, somebody would question their veracity. And but this all comes to an end in the 1820s in any meaningful way. And so at no point were Jews denied their right to be part of the body politic and to participate in the political realm, to assert their interests however they defined it. But I think more importantly, American politics, partly because of the two-party system. Okay, we know there were always there were often third parties, and the important thing about third parties is they always failed. No third party ever had any traction. They sometimes nudged one of the others a little bit, but America has been a historically two-party system of a kind of winner-take-all structure. It's not a parliamentary system, and therefore the two parties, other than on the issue of race, That is, the black-white divide before the Civil War on the slavery issue, then after the end of Reconstruction on the right of the South to do whatever it wanted to its population, to its non-white population. Other than that, the parties were pretty much the same. Okay, Helen Keller once defined them as the party of Tweedledee and Tweedledum. They said basically that both of them serve capitalism, and they have slightly different tweaks, but they're the same thing. And in that kind of environment, besides the fact there was never an anti-Jewish party or an anti-immigrant party or an anti-Semitic or anti-immigrant party, the two parties wanted only one thing from the Jews, and that's from the level of dog catcher to president, which was their votes. Okay, their votes were always yearned for, and the Jews were always courted as an interest group who, one by one, their votes counted. And so, therefore, the political system was one which tended to be non-ideological. And when there's no ideology, again, with the exception of African Americans, okay, whose history is so different, and we can obviously throw in, the Chinese are, in some ways, they're not even part of the story. They're part of the story in terms of the issue of race, but since they were denied the right to be naturalized, they couldn't vote anyhow, and they couldn't be they weren't going to be courted, and their numbers were, in some ways, way too small to be certainly on the national level. Worth wooing. Neither party ever defined the Jews as a problem, but both wanted their votes. Neither party wrote them off as potential voters or refused to give them something. And so very early on, in the 1830s, 1840s, on the local level, on the state level, Jews are being asked to run for this or to run for that. Tammany Hall, one of New York's contributions to world civilization, very early on recognized that, the Jews are coming, they're voting, we bring them in. We don't keep them out, and what slots go to the Jews, what slots are going to go to then the Italians, what slots are going to go to this, and so in a way the political machine, Tammany is just the most famous of those, were important not only meeting points for Jews and other immigrants and Jews and Americans of longer standing, but it served as a kind of clearinghouse to iron out the animosities that may have existed at other levels. So even by the late 1920s, when for the first time Jews became almost completely associated with the Democratic Party. So until then, the Jewish vote split between the Republicans and the Democrats pretty evenly. By the end of the 1920s, it becomes pretty much completely Democratic. I think Franklin Roosevelt got 98% of the Jewish vote in 1936. But the Republicans were still going to Jewish communal meetings and trying to break that stronghold, okay, because they understood that Jewish votes counted because this was one by one majoritarian politics. So this Tweedledee and Tweedledum political structure quashed extremism. Jewish men got to participate along with their non-Jewish male neighbors, later on Jewish women, and in this they helped. They were benefited by a political system which I would say was defanged. Okay, because it didn't exacerbate ideological differences. Not that Jews, as they bargained with political operatives, always got what they wanted, and we obviously have some pretty significant examples of where they failed. All interest groups failed when their interests differed from that of the majority of society. So I believe I have now gone over. So these 5 factors: immigration, color, race as color, the economic dynamism of America, the fact that religion and state were utterly separated, and religion could be viewed as a good thing because it was a matter of private morality and not state policy, and then defanged two-party, non-ideological politics, all created an environment in which Jews could arrive into an environment which worked for them. They arrived in a large enough number to be able to create the kinds of communities they wanted, but not too large to be defined as a problem by others. They could take advantage of realities which worked for them but disadvantaged other people, and they could apply their economic skills, sharpened in a very different environment to American material realities. And in that process, they helped make America, I don't want to say great, but they helped make America attractive for other Jews. Okay,
So we have time for questions, people? Yeah.
Yes.
So, thank you, that was fascinating. So, the really obvious question is, so what went wrong?
Well, so can I throw that back to you?
Yeah.
Okay, and what do you mean by what went wrong?
Well, I think clearly there was a lot of fight shortly after the 20s, certainly in the wake of World War I, and certainly in the lead up to World War II, and even more strongly afterwards. There was a huge swell of anti-Semitism.
Right.
And if it, I mean, did it come out of nowhere? Or was it latent, and did certain economic realities bring it out the way they did in Europe? I mean, because if there hadn't been any wars, would American Jewry have assimilated completely perfectly, and there would be no anti-Semitism in this country?
Okay, so let me begin with your last. Now, it's great. I mean, it's obviously 3 or 4 lectures or several books. So on the one hand, I think the question of assimilation versus anti-Semitism are on some level 2 different questions. Look, there was always some sense of this is a Christian nation, and there, by the way, was an effort came up several times to have a constitutional amendment to declare the United States a Christian nation, and it always failed. Okay, and it's very interesting that was something that was on the political landscape, and it just never went anywhere. But there were always people who questioned, were the Jews too much this, too much that, too aggressive, one problem was, they seemed to be doing too well, okay, and
Affirmative action.
yeah.
And that was, there are all these kind of, I mean, the reason I asked the question is because you presented such a rosy picture.
Mm-hmm.
That
Well, I think anti-Semitism as a factor was actually pretty minor in America. And I say that first, immigration restriction was not particularly about the Jews. It was about all European, again, some people got no quota, and that is Asia, Africa, Middle East, 0 quota. Okay, so it was about all European immigrants, and the group that probably was most severely restricted number were the Italians. Okay, and you can go through the 1911, the 41 volumes of the Dillingham Commission, which paved the way for immigration restriction. And the Jews show up, but it's about the Italians this, the Italians that. And I remember that non-Jews from this, Jews are not mentioned in the immigration restriction laws at all. It's by country of origin, and so people from Poland get a low quota, but it covered Polish Christians just as much as Polish Jews. So I think that it's more than just anti-Semitism. And we could take every one of the criteria that we consider to be examples of American anti-Semitism and yes, you're right, I mean, your timing is perfect, from World War I, really until the end of World War II into the 1950s, it was at its height. But it's always problematic when we start looking at it really closely. And I'll give one example. So in 1922, Harvard instituted its quotas against Jewish students. And it set the quota at 10%. Okay, now Jews are 3% of the population. Jews are getting 10% of the quotas. And a number of donors to Harvard, Jewish donors, got them to make it 20%. Okay, not on paper. Okay, there's a wonderful letter, so revealing, from the dean of the medical school at Yale to the director of admissions, and he said, take 5 Jews, 3 Catholics, and no Negroes. Okay, so I mean, yes, but the fact is, Jews are discriminated against, but we have to think about it in this context of a multiracial, multicultural society, and I don't mean that in any logical terms, where there are lots of different people, and Jews are not necessarily the most obvious victims. The last thing I want to say, because obviously it's such a good question, is in the period, in the lead up to World War II, the fact that the United States was not responsive to Jewish pleading for lifting the quotas is, there's no way around it. And the only thing we can say is that, on the one hand, the United States took the largest number of German Jewish refugees of any country in the world, more than England. Okay, 100. So, but Americans did not want immigrants. They didn't want immigrants. They didn't care where they came from, who they were. They didn't want immigrants. The Depression is still raging. And while there were people in the State Department who were out and out anti-Semites, like, from central casting, okay, but I think there was just so much more going on. Okay, so again, I don't mean to give short shrift.
In some ways, that's not really what your talk is about.
Yeah.
So it's not really a fair question.
No, it was good, but it was a good question. Yes.
I have a question about, maybe this is outside of your expertise, but about Canada, because a couple things, it's impossible to listen to your talk and not think about
Absolutely.
attitudes of the current moment, and if you looked at the United States versus Canada, I don't know, if I were emigrating, I think I would be drawn to Canada.
Absolutely.
It seems more welcoming.
You get better health insurance. You don't have to fill out all the.
Was there a real difference? Was there just
Well, the
a
difference was that Canada's economy never took off. Okay, and if you're a young family living in Ukraine or Lithuania, and you say Jewish family, you want to say, where am I going to be able to make a living? Where am I going to do the best? Canada offered very few robust opportunities, and in fact, there's an enormous Canadian migration into the United States. Okay, so Canadians are leaving because, remember, just think of it geographically, Canada is arable for about 100 miles from the US border only. Okay, and the rest of it, I'm sure is beautiful, frozen tundra and so on, but not so great for farming. Whereas what's remarkable about the United States is that you have this landmass, obviously incorporated into the United States as a result of colonial imperialism, okay, but it's all arable. And so the possibility of development of farming, forestry, mining was just incomparable. Okay, Canada was, now interestingly, Jews had a much harder time in Quebec, which was divided between 2 groups, the French and the English. And those are often very difficult situations for a new immigrant group to come into. But there was no place like that in the United States. It was this whole jumble of people, and Jews were not particularly notable for their immigrantness, but that would have only explained Montreal, Quebec. Okay, and certainly many Jews did go to Canada, and after the 1920s, the number picks up because it's impossible to come to the United States. But Libby Garland tells us that many of those Canadian Jews become illegal immigrants to the United States. So it just, the economy just was incomparable. Yes?
A question that sort of goes back to Deborah's in a way. I was thinking, especially during during point number 2, about the book, I can't generate its author's name now, How Jews Became White Folks.
Yeah, Karen Brodkin.
Yeah, so was that wrong, or was that about a different period of time, particularly the period of time that Deborah was invoking,
right,
in which anti-Semitism was more apparent and maybe more systematized in culture, if not in the realms, economy, politics that you're talking about here, that then there was another. I mean, obviously, it's hard to generalize centuries, but
it's a great question. I think the book is just completely wrong.
Okay.
I mean, again, you could say that, you know, Jews were deprecated in, you know, on the stage, in the press, you know, in, you know, some news. There are places where, you know, stereotype jokes, kind of ugly images abounded. Okay, and Jews had to navigate uncomfortable spaces here and there. Okay, but being white in America, and we I mean, my biggest problem with that book and with the whole kind of analysis is that being white or not white had tremendous political implications, and Jews never experienced the impact of not being defined as white, including being able to immigrate, being able to naturalize, to become citizens, to bring their families over, to to do whatever a white person could do. So if only 5 of them are going to get into the Yale Medical School, I mean, it's not nice, but it's very different than not being white.
Right.
And
so it was maybe an over-application of the concept of whiteness to prejudice.
Yeah. And in fact, but it seems to me as a historian, and one has to be really careful about the language one uses, particularly in a situation where if on the form it says white, that conveys a universe of privilege. And historically, present and empirically measurable. And so what bothers me a lot about that literature is, well, it's metaphor. Well, I think historians normally don't do well with metaphor. We want, the fact. And particularly in the period, again, that you were referring to, interestingly, it's a period of tremendous economic mobility for Jews. Okay, so whatever, so again, Yale only said 5 Jews could get into the class. It was in 1931. By a study done in the late 1950s, a third of all doctors in Boston were Jewish. So, and yeah, I mean, well, again, I'm not saying it was a good, it was neutral, but it was not a barrier to what ultimately brought immigrants to the United States was economic stability and economic mobility. Okay, and I saw another, yes. Okay.
Oh, yeah. This might be sort of splitting hairs, but there have been arguments made that a number of white European groups who were always considered white were, the category of whiteness was thought of differently in the 19th century, such that there might be some people who were considered dark whites or not fully white, and had to kind of prove that they in fact did belong into the white category. And a similar argument has been made for the Irish. And for the Irish, I know there's been a lot of ink spilled about how Irish immigrants went out of their way to prove that they belonged in the white category by distancing themselves from Black Americans and by making that distinction very clear to people. And there was a long history of very horrible relationship between these two groups. And so I wondered if you could say a little bit more about this sort of the idea that there might have been a different way of thinking about whiteness in the 19th century than the present, and if you have anything in particular to say about the relationship between Jews and Black Americans.
Okay, great. So again, several hours. Okay. So, on the one hand, yes. I mean, obviously the word white was used differently. And by the way, when the Immigration Service began to, after Ellis Island and the other, after the federal government took over immigration and create a set of forms to fill out, there are, they ask race, and they ask color. And so the race could be Italian, but the color, white. And since the law was, this bathroom is for white people, or the right to vote is for white people, or the right to go to the University of Mississippi is for white people, okay, we can see the differences between being white or not white, even though the race on the form might say Italian. Okay, that's really just on the immigration forms. So to prove whiteness, well, I think for Jews, what it meant was, and again, let's maybe bracket the word white. I think their goal, this comes up very much in this issue of religion, was to prove respectability. Okay, and that is, it was very important for them to not appear in public as kind of wildly gesticulating with their hands and speaking odd language in public, and so there's a tremendous emphasis on acquiring the outward skills or the outward trappings of respectability. And we see all sorts of synagogues that began to fine people for talking during services or for spitting during services. So it was okay. Now they're clearly looking upward. Okay, and I think that this is something that Jews in the modern period did every place they went, in Germany, in England, in the big cities in Eastern Europe. And so in a way, it takes it away from the discussion about race and more about the discussion about civility and respectability. Okay, now the question about Jews and African Americans, that was actually my first book. And so on the one hand, Jews had tremendous economic interactions with African Americans because in that involvement with small business, Jews provide much of the small business infrastructure in African American communities. Okay, how to assess the nature of that interaction depends, are you the customer or are you the shopkeeper? And some of the customers, Colin Powell used to say, well, he was really proud of the fact he spoke Yiddish because he actually worked as a kid, as a high school student, he had a part-time job working for a Jewish pharmacist in Harlem. So, it's a really complex relationship. I think what makes the part of the story very interesting, and I think it's the quest for respectability, is that Jews as individuals, until, by the way, the World War II period, and after the World War II period, through Jewish communal organizations, identified themselves with the civil rights struggle. And rather than distance themselves, they come in, and I think for a variety of motives, and one is because they had something to gain from it, and I don't mean that in a cynical way, but rather a society that doesn't take cognizance in matters of policy about who you are and where you came from, is not going to have quotas. Okay, also I think it was a way to prove their respectability as they interact with the other white upper middle class Protestants who are also part of that civil rights initiative. And so that these Jews, most of them from the children of the Central European migration of the early part of the 19th century, but also some among the the trade unionists of the late 19th, early 20th century, commit themselves to the civil rights struggle. And again, with the rise of Nazism, Jewish organizations begin to say, we're part of this too. So it is a different story, but then in a way they had different political agenda than the Irish. But it was always as helping white people. They were white people who were helping the blacks. And so they're not giving up their whiteness to say, I want to be part of a local or national or state level, or national civil rights enterprise. That's a great question. Yes.
So I was going to say, I don't know that we've had any questions from the graduate students yet.
Oh,
so
okay, great.
anyone
Okay.
wants to-
Okay, great.
I think it's about your statistics. I'm wondering in your numbers, how I guess those numbers were achieved, because if those people who are in the 95% or 30% of being Jewish, how they identified themselves, was Jewishness kind of their first and foremost identity in terms of before being from Poland, right? So the kids of immigrants, would they still use the term Jewishness as we are in kind of this racial structure? Yeah.
So again,
right,
a book or two. Yeah. So I think that we see. I mean, I think this is the way I should answer your question, because it's very good, it's very complicated. There's certainly some individuals who are part of this migration, who come to the United States and they see, how permeable and how fluid it is, and they drop out.
Yeah.
Okay, and there was a great story when John Kerry was running for president, that his grandfather was a Jewish immigrant from Galicia, and he had done pretty well, and he decided, actually it's kind of a bit of a burden to be Jewish, and he became, John Kerry. Okay, ironically picking an Irish last name, and John Kerry was kind of floored by the fact that that was his family. He didn't even know that. So some drop out, and that's a number we do not know, and it comes up through anecdote. Most of them are committed, and this is part of who they are. It isn't the only thing that they are, and they're also union members, and they're also socialists, and they're also from Lithuania, and they're also New Yorkers. And Jewish is one of a constellation of four, sort of characteristics that define them, and at different times of the day or different times of the year, one becomes more important than the other. But what's notable, and again, what made the United States very different, and here I'm going to also actually Canada. Oh no, I'm going to put Canada to the side, because I think actually there's provincial difference there. These are never government collected statistics. As the United States, the census never asks religion. Okay, asks birthplace, and then I think starting like 1910 it began to ask parents' birthplace. So all of the statistics on Jews are utterly unreliable, because we don't know where they come from, and sometimes it was based on synagogue membership. Okay, great, that leaves out the majority who didn't belong to a synagogue, and as statistics, sort of different kinds of population surveys are done, different methods are tried. So these are always rough guesses in terms of the number. Some, even starting as early as the 1910s, some Jewish communal agencies that wanted to know the number would look at school statistics and how many children did not attend school on Yom Kippur, and then they extrapolate statistically from that. Okay, because how else would you know? I mean, you stand out on a street corner, and so your question is a really good one, and it's really hard to answer. But rather, I'd say historically, historically, what it meant to individuals, families, communities changed. And not everybody was the same, and obviously I think one of the real shortcomings of my half-hour talk is that it made it sound like this is a singular experience, and for every point I made there are going to be hundreds of variations. A notoriously anarchic group of people who agree on very little. Okay, other than opposition to anti-Semitism, and although they differ tremendously on how to deal with it. So, I'd say in the main, where they came from, were they from Lithuania, were they from Ukraine, were they from Galicia, probably mattered relatively little, although not completely, because there were social, organizations based on town of origin, but very quickly people married beyond those, those kind of loyalties, and sometimes people belonged to one's like a hometown society, not because they were actually from that place, but they had better picnics. So they had better snacks at the meetings. So it's a very fluid and problematic category. And because they were white, it was voluntary, and the law did not pigeonhole them and say, this is the box you're in.
So maybe to wrap things up, because I know some people have places they need to go, I just wanted to thank Hasia yet again and point out that I feel like the information that you've given us really corresponds to a lot of the discussions we've been having at the various lunchtime meetings about Jewish material culture, and like particularly the issue of how complicated it is for who gets to decide when an object is Jewish, that a lot of the issues you've raised both get at like how things might change over time, but also the arbitrariness of like our statistical decisions about what counts at various points. The other thing that I thought was really interesting to me about that emphasis on immigrants that I've been noticing as I've been doing the various lectures, that a lot of the people are constantly a new generation of Jewish immigrants coming in. And I do think that intersection between people coming into the United States constantly, as opposed to thinking of like Jews came and they just stayed forever, really important for us thinking about how to understand the various objects and what are the influences that they're having, as well as that discussion back about how to prove you're a good immigrant at various points.
You know, if I could throw in a material
Yeah, sure.
culture, so it was one of those many comedians who have, you know, their Jewish jokes, who said you could always tell a Jewish apartment if they had plastic slipcovers on the furniture. And that was the most important denotation, not, you know, mezuzah on the door, but plastic slipcovers on the couch.
Some of my relatives would super appreciate that.
Right.
Well, thank you very much.
My
Hasia.
pleasure.